in the grand candlelit halls of Europe, where lords and scholars debated philosophy and alchemists promised eternal youth, there existed a hunger so strange, so quietly monstrous, that it slips past the golden images of Renaissance glory we like to remember. Because for centuries, Europeans were not just fascinated with mummies. They ground them into powder, mixed them into wine, and swallowed the dead, bone and resin, and all, in the desperate hope that the flesh of the ancient world might heal the ailments of their own. It sounds like a grotesque folk tale, whispered in the corners of a dark room, but it was real, practiced openly by kings, physicians, and the bustling markets of cities that claimed to be the height of civilization. In the minds of these people, the mummy, once a sacred guardian of eternity in the tombs of Egypt, became just another commodity, scraped from its linen wrappings, broken apart, and sold by the ounce in glass jars, labeled as medicine, as if the ancient dead were nothing more than a rare spice to be sprinkled into the blood-soaked pages of European history. This wasn't a rare, hidden practice for madmen on the fringe. It was a trend that lasted hundreds of years, so ordinary that it appeared in medical texts, court records, and diaries of nobles who noted mummy powder alongside the price of wine and the weight of silver. The dead were devoured not in an act of survival, but in an act of faith, in the belief that death itself, properly prepared and swallowed, might keep death at bay. And if you think that history is a story of progress, of civilization slowly shaking off the darkness of superstition, you only need to look here, to the centuries when Europe feasted on the dead, to remember that history is dark, and this is one of the darkest chapters we have. Why did Europeans, who built cathedrals reaching for heaven and commissioned paintings that captured the divine, decide it was a good idea to grind up ancient human remains and swallow them by the spoonful? It was not madness alone. It was medicine, or so they believed. In the medieval and Renaissance mindset, the world was a tapestry of hidden sympathies, secret correspondences between the body and the universe. Disease was not simply an imbalance of humors, but an affliction that could be fought with the right counter-force. And in this worldview, like cures was not superstition, it was science. Blood disorders. Take blood. Bone pain. Take powdered bone. Death approaching. Consume death to repel it. Mummies, dug from the sands of Egypt, embalmed with bitumen, resins, and herbs that had preserved them for centuries, were thought to be infused with mystical healing powers. The resins used in embalming were believed to have absorbed not only medicinal properties, but also the essence of ancient vitality. To these doctors and apothecaries, the mummy was a vessel of ancient strength, a distillation of the healing properties of the earth itself. And so, mummy powder became a cure. All headaches, epilepsy, internal bleeding. These were treated with doses of ground mummy flesh, sometimes washed down with wine, sometimes mixed into tinctures, or simply swallowed with water while a physician nodded in approval. It wasn't just charlatans in back alleys pushing this cure, it was the best minds of the age. Paracelsus, the famous Swiss physician, an alchemist, whose work laid the groundwork for modern toxicology and chemical medicine, openly endorsed corpse medicine. He argued that the flesh of the dead, properly prepared, was a powerful medicine capable of curing even the gravest of ills. In his eyes, the boundaries between life and death were meant to be navigated, harnessed, and consumed for the sake of survival. Renaissance doctors in fine robes, practicing in the echoing halls of European courts, saw no contradiction in prescribing a tincture of human remains to their noble patients, while lecturing on virtue and morality. In fact, for many, it was an act of faith in the power of nature, in the wisdom of the ancients, and in the desperate hope that by swallowing the dead, they could ward off the darkness creeping toward them. Because in an age where medicine was a thin line between superstition and experimentation, consuming the dead seemed as rational as necessary as bleeding a patient or praying for their soul. And so, the dead became a commodity. Mummies transformed from sacred guardians of eternity into bitter powder, a strange and dark medicine swallowed in candlelit rooms as Europe tried to keep death at bay by devouring it, one spoonful at a time. Imagine the deserts of Egypt, winds sighing over half-buried tomb entrances, while beneath, the dead waited in darkness for eternity. Or so they thought. But eternity had a price, and Europe was willing to pay it. So the tomb raiders came with chisels, lanterns, and sacks, tearing open coffins, unwrapping linen bandages, snapping brittle limbs from mummified bodies to be packed in crates and shipped across the sea. What began as the theft of treasures and amulets turned into the theft of the bodies themselves. Europe's hunger for mummy powder was insatiable, and so entire supply chains grew around the dead. Merchants in Cairo and Alexandria became middlemen in the trafficking of corpses, selling dismembered mummies by the pound, scraping resin and dried flesh into sacks labeled mumia. What was once holy and revered became a trade commodity, bundled like spices and silks, and carried on the same trade routes that moved gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When the supply of genuine Egyptian mummies began to dwindle under the relentless greed of European buyers, the merchants adapted. They turned to the bodies of recently executed criminals, drying them in ovens, rubbing them with bitumen or pitch to simulate the darkened, resinous appearance of true mummies. These counterfeit mummies were ground into powder and sold in Europe under the same name, mumia, for the same price, sometimes even with greater profit margins for the sellers, who no longer had to smuggle crates from the deserts of Egypt. In the apothecaries of London, Paris, and Venice, mumia was kept in jars on dark wooden shelves alongside other powders and elixirs. Customers would come seeking relief from headaches, seizures, bleeding gums, or a general fear of death. And the apothecary would carefully weigh out a portion, scraping the dark powder into packets to be mixed with wine or dissolved in oil. Prices fluctuated depending on the origin of the mumia, and the rumors attached to it. Powder from a noble mummy was said to be more potent, while the flesh of a recently executed criminal, if thoroughly prepared, could be a bargain substitute for those who could not afford the imported dead. And so, while Europe busied itself with art, science, and the bright bloom of the Renaissance, it was quietly consuming the dead to soothe its fear of mortality. Trade caravans and merchant ships moved through the Mediterranean, carrying silks, spices, and flesh ground to dust, while the graves of Egypt emptied, and the gallows across Europe supplied a grisly market. Because in this dark chapter of history, the dead were currency, sold by the pound, traded for gold, and consumed by the living, who believed that swallowing the essence of another's death might cheat their own. In the flickering candlelight of Europe's palaces, the same hands that signed edicts held scepters and lifted goblets to toast alliances were the hands that lifted small silver spoons of mummy powder to trembling lips. This was not a hidden vice of the desperate poor. It was a fashion among kings, queens, and the noble elite, who believed that swallowing the dust of ancient flesh might keep their own flesh from failing. Francis I of France, stricken with illness, was known to consume powdered mummy mixed into wine, hoping the mysterious strength of the ancients would restore him. Charles II of England, the merry monarch, dabbled in chemical experiments and remedies, reportedly using king's drops, a concoction containing dissolved human skull, which often went hand in hand with powdered mummy in medical circles of the time. To these rulers, swallowing the dead was not barbaric. It was fashionable science, endorsed by their court physicians, and the best medical minds they could hire. In the bustling apothecaries of Paris and London, jars of mumia sat among dried herbs and exotic spices, waiting for customers to request their measure of death. The apothecaries would weigh out the powder, sometimes mixing it with wine for a quick drink, sometimes blending it into chocolate, a luxury rising in popularity among Europe's elite. Those who could not afford such delicacies might simply swallow the powder dry, washing it down with water while hoping it would ward off sickness. To modern eyes, it is grotesque, but to them, it was commonplace. Consuming the dead was as normalized as bleeding, purging, or using leeches. Another grim tool in the fight against the constant presence of disease and death. It was not shocking to see a court physician measure out a dose of powdered mummy for a headache, nor was it unusual to see nobles request it for persistent coughs, fevers, or fear of plague. What we now see as cannibalistic horror, they saw as medical prudence. The fear of death was so powerful that it allowed for quiet acceptance of corpse consumption in daily life. Parents might give their children small doses in hope of protecting them, and the wealthy might travel with packets of mumia in their personal medicine chests as a precaution. Europeans, who called other cultures savage and barbaric, unwrapped the dead of ancient lands and consumed them under the glow of chandeliers, convinced that death could keep death at bay, that swallowing the dust of long, dead flesh could cheat the grave. Because in the end, the fear of death can drive even the most civilized to consume the dead in desperation, convincing themselves that the darkness they swallow is somehow light. They called themselves civilized. They built cathedrals, painted saints on ceilings, and sent missionaries across oceans to preach salvation. They scrawled in journals about heathens and savages, claiming moral superiority over the people they conquered, traded with, and enslaved. And yet, in candlelit chambers and bustling marketplaces, these same Europeans ate the dead, swallowing the flesh of ancient mummies ground into powder, all in the name of health and medicine. How did they justify it? In the medieval and Renaissance worldview, there was no clear boundary between religion and medicine. The Church taught that the body was sacred, a vessel for the soul, to be respected in life and death. Yet, as disease swept through Europe again and again, people turned to any remedy that might offer hope, even if it meant consuming human remains. Physicians argued that the mummy, infused with embalming resins and ancient earth, held a mystical essence that could cure the living. Clerics rarely interfered, and in many cases, the Church sanctioned corpse medicine, seeing it as an extension of God's will if it healed the faithful. It was a powerful rationalization. If it cures, it must be acceptable. If it prevents death, it must be holy. The dead, they believed, could save the living, and the discomfort of consuming human flesh was drowned out by fear of plague, epilepsy, and early graves. It was easy to push aside the quiet horror of the act when physicians in fine robes and priests in dark vestments nodded approval. But beneath the surface lay hypocrisy, so deep it rotted the moral foundations of the so-called civilized world. Europeans condemned other cultures for cannibalism, calling them savages, in pamphlets and sermons, while they themselves consumed the flesh of the dead without a second thought. They scoffed at indigenous practices they barely understood while unwrapping the sacred dead of Egypt, crushing them into powder, and mixing them into wine. There was also a dark undercurrent of colonial entitlement. The tombs of Egypt, built by hands that had long since turned to dust, were considered nothing more than treasure troves for European explorers, traders, and grave robbers. The bodies within, once carefully preserved to ensure an eternal afterlife, were ripped from their resting places, stripped of dignity, and turned into a commodity for European consumption. The people whose ancestors lay in those tombs had no say as centuries of their history were reduced to dust in European hands. And so the hypocrisy deepened Europe, claiming to bring civilization and Christianity to the world, desecrated graves, consumed human remains, and profited from the dead in the name of medicine, all while looking down on the people they robbed. calling them primitive. Because fear of death can erode morality. Desperation can justify horrors. And when those in power decide they are entitled to the bodies of the dead, history records yet another dark chapter in humanity's endless struggle to conquer the grave. They saw themselves as enlightened, but in the glow of their candles, in the hush of their prayers, they swallowed the darkness of the dead, convinced that it was the light that would save them. But nothing lasts forever, not even Europe's hunger for the dead. As the 18th century dawned, the flicker of Enlightenment rationality began to reach into even the dustiest corners of medicine. Scientists, skeptical thinkers, and reform-minded physicians began to challenge the old corpse medicine traditions that had dominated Europe for centuries. Anatomy and biology advanced. Microscopes revealed the hidden worlds of disease, and the slow realization dawned that grinding up mummified flesh was not, in fact, a miracle cure, but rather another superstition, clinging to the robes of doctors who feared change as much as they feared death. The very practice that had once seemed sophisticated began to appear barbaric, backward, and deeply distasteful. Why, critics asked, should a person of faith and reason consume the dead to save themselves? Moral discomfort grew alongside medical skepticism, and the quiet hypocrisy of condemning other cultures as savage, while unwrapping and eating the ancient dead became harder to ignore. Simultaneously, a new fascination with Egypt began to transform European attitudes. Archaeologists, scholars, and explorers turned their eyes toward the Nile, not as a tomb to plunder for profit, but as a world of ancient wonders to be studied, catalogued, and preserved. The dawn of Egyptology turned the mummy from a medicine to a museum exhibit. The same European powers that once funded grave robbers and mummy traders now built glass cases in museums to display these stolen dead as curiosities, remnants of a world that felt both alien and connected to their own history. Public exhibitions of mummies, archaeological expeditions, and scholarly papers reframed the mummy as a window into the past, deserving of study and reverence rather than consumption. Romantic notions of ancient Egypt, tied to its architecture and mythology, slowly replaced the purely utilitarian view of the mummy as nothing more than a commodity for the apothecary's shelf. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, medical journals and physicians began to formally reject the use of mummy powder, recognizing it as ineffective and unhygienic. The few who continued to prescribe it became fringe figures in a rapidly changing medical landscape. Even so, whispers of its use continued, and mummy powder could still be found in some dusty apothecaries and personal medicine chests well into the early 19th century, like a ghost of Europe's darkest appetites, refusing to leave quietly. The last shipments of mummy powder faded as Egypt cracked down on grave robbing and European laws shifted to protect archaeological sites. The mummy trade that had once moved with the caravans of merchants across the Mediterranean slowly dried up, and the market for human remains, once bustling and open, became an embarrassment best forgotten. But the history remains. Europe's centuries-long practice of consuming the dead in the hope of cheating death ended not because it was seen as immoral in itself, but because the world changed around it. Science advanced, medicine modernized, and the dead, at last, were given the dignity of silence behind museum glass instead of being ground down into bitter powder, to be swallowed in desperation. It is a chapter that reminds us how easily fear can override morality, how superstition can masquerade as science, and how even the so-called enlightened can be driven to the darkest acts in their duration to escape the inevitable. History is dark, and we must remember it.